Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Right. Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore, Explain. I have two very special guests with me today. I've got Cole Nussbaumer Knaflic and Mike Cisneros, although I had to remind myself, Mike, not to say Visneros, because for many, many years, that's how I knew you as a handle. In this episode, we're going to talk about a new book that you both have been working on, as well as your colleague, Alex, who's not with us today. But hi to Alex out there, I'm sure, watching and listening in due course. But to start with, rather than me trying to introduce yourselves, because you know yourselves better than anyone else can know yourselves, who are you? Where are you today? And just give me a little bit of background about your role and your background in database. I'll come to you first, Mike.
All right. I'm Mike Cisneros. Thanks for having me, Andy. I am a data storyteller at Storytelling with Data, which I always say is a mouthful when you say it in a row like that. What it means these days is I get to take a lot of the material that Cole has developed over the course of her many years of thinking about, writing about, talking about data visualization, and teach that to people, individuals, organizations all around the world. And I came to this by virtue of having an experience throughout a number of different industries. I was a data analyst for a long time. I was also a graphic designer. I was a software developer. I kind of hit all of the different technical and creative things you need along the way in order to learn how to communicate effectively with data. And so when the opportunity came for me to join up with Cole, teach some of this to other people, and ultimately collaborate on a book about it, it was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up.
Absolutely. Completely agree with that. So, Cole, that's a glowing review to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we opened up the application process, I think we put a posting on the blog, and I remember being, Mike Cisneros applied. How cool. So my name's Cole. I am joining you today from sunny Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I think summer has come back before we fully get into fall here. I have a background career-wise in banking and at Google in people analytics, but for the past 15 years have been running Storytelling with Data, where we teach people how to make graphs that make sense and go beyond the data visualization to really think about the journey we want to take our audience on, motivating them to understand something in a new way or act or have a discussion in a smarter way. We do that through the books, which I know we're going to talk about today, our workshops, the blog, the podcast, the videos, our community, all the things.
All the channels, absolutely. And yeah, I guess Cole and you and I have had I guess a similar sort of duration in this field. And when we get to the end of the chat about the book today, I want to just sort of reflect on that period because I think we're in an interesting time right now. I'm not going to say a bad time or a worse time, but maybe a different time
A different time.
coming up. We'll see how we'll get on through that. But yes, as we alluded to there, we're going to talk about a book, a new book that you've worked on and published, and I think it came out last week even. It's very recent. It's fresh out the oven. This is titled Before and After, Practical Makeovers for Powerful Data Stories. Makeovers instantly grab my attention because I love them. Everyone loves them. It's one of the first lines in the book, which we'll explore in a second. But I'm delighted to see this book out now. Now, this for you, Cole, is book number 5. There's a there's a book number 6 even on its way now. I mean, which is incredibly frequent.
Like 5.5 maybe.
5.5, yeah, I suppose it's you can speak to that in a second, but why do you keep coming back to writing books? You obviously enjoy the process. You obviously feel that they are still viable. What's the where do you see the role of a book in this sort of day and age?
It's funny because I was just last week talking to several hundred third graders about
Right.
Daphne and data drawing superpowers for little ones. But this is a question that they often ask: why do you write books?
Mm,
And I really think my answer to that audience is the same as to those listening today, which is, for me, writing a book is such an interesting way. I think, one, to get the ideas out of my head and put order and structure around them, that there's utility just in that. But the bigger reason is to be able to take those ideas and spread them.
yeah.
And I really feel like if we've figured out how to do some things that will make people more effective in their work, or get people to pay attention to something that they otherwise wouldn't have, or simplify rather than overcomplicate, if we can take what we've learned over the years and by working with so many different clients
Mm,
and spread that, I think it just elevates the sort of conversations that can be had and decisions that can be made broadly. And
absolutely.
so
I think
that
that's a
motivates me.
yeah, that's a perfect summary. And I'm not here to put words in your mouth, but I also feel that there is so much to be said about this subject that doesn't always fit into a single book, and nor should it.
Yes.
And it's always changing. We've spoken just there about the possibility of maybe the field is evolving right now at quite a rapid pace, but it doesn't sit still. And so even if it's not necessarily always new things to say, it can be new things about the same topics that you've
Well,
got
and
maybe a new
different,
fresh lens, possibly different
yes,
language.
different ways to explain it,
Yeah,
different examples or corner cases or case studies to be able to show these things through. And there's value in that, so that you can give people something where they can see something of themselves or their work through the examples. It's funny
right.
because you said something when we were chatting before we started recording that I've said frequently, that I felt after I finished my first book, which was just, I've got no words left to say. I put them all into this book. But now, 5 books later, clearly that's not the case. But it's this evolution of ideas and approaches, because for me, the fundamental lessons haven't changed.
Mm,
But there's so many nuances when it comes to how we can apply them and how we can teach them to others, that's where the interesting bits just, they keep coming.
absolutely. Now, Mike, from your perspective, and forgive me if I'm incorrect in this statement, but I believe this is your first foray into book writing. Um, what in the lead up to this becoming a thing that you were going to work on, what was your attitude towards it? What was your levels of, I don't know, kind of joy at the prospect of writing a book, or anxiety of writing a book? I know when I first wrote my book, it was a simultaneously a wonderful opportunity and exciting, but also then, wow, I'm gonna have to put my words down on paper and put that out into the open world. What was the mindset as you kind of approach this task?
Well, it is less of a new thing than it is a homecoming for me, because one of the
Right.
very first things I did professionally was write travel guides.
Oh, wow.
And this was right at the end of my college experience. And I can remember being 22 years old, out of college, and I was interviewing for a job in San Diego, and I lived in Boston. And those are complete opposite corners of the United States. So you can't get there all in one go. So there was a stopover in St. Louis. And I remember going into a bookstore in St. Louis and seeing my book with my name on it in the bookstore in
Wow.
St. Louis. And it was a good dramatic moment for me of, I remembered all of the effort that went into creating this
Mm,
collaborative effort of me and the writers and the editors. I was an editor on this guide. And also realizing just how pervasive this work could be in the world. It was going to have a direct impact on the lives of so many people I never would know and could never know. And that I had such a responsibility, I realized in that moment, to give good information to people, but
mm.
also the opportunity to make their experiences better in so many different ways. It was at that moment that I decided I was going to go into publishing for my entire career, and you see how that turned out. I eventually did go into magazine publishing for a while, but then this interesting thing happened. There was this new technology called the World Wide Web that
Oh,
got its
yes.
hooks into me, and so I transitioned out of publishing. But this was a coming back around to it. I had always enjoyed writing. I'd written my own blog. I've been writing for the Storytelling with Data blog as well. My wife and I self-published a few books along the way, but this is the first professional tome, I would say, that I've gotten to be a part of in nigh on 30 years.
Wow. So yes, you've got the stamps of this sort of experience before then. I mean, it's fascinating to hear that you did a travel guide. I mean, there feels like there's lots of parallels and sort of metaphors we can draw from that in terms of the guidance of how to travel through the process of creating a data viz, and in this case, makeover and making over a data viz. That's fascinating. Now, obviously, as we said, there are three authors for this book. And we'll shortly look at just the sort of mechanics of how you kind of work together to do this, because I guess it's a different dynamic and it's something that involves having to find a common tone of voice and a common structure to the content within that. But just from a very kind of contextual perspective, I guess the starting point is when did this seed of an opportunity arise, either from within yourselves as a we need to write a book about this stuff, or opportunity from the publishers? I guess there's a chicken and egg thing there as well. But when did it all start, and what was the moment when you kind of collectively said, "Yes, we will write a book"?
I don't know if I remember the moment. Do you remember the moment, Mike? I know we had the idea of doing a, quote unquote makeovers book
Mm.
for a number of years before we decided to go ahead with it. Do you remember, Mike?
I remember that we sketched out the idea for what the book might look like in the classic sticky note fashion
Hmm.
Yep.
back
That was on the
in
floor in
this.
my office, right?
Yep, us
Why
crawling
were we on
around
the
on the
floor?
floor
I don't even know.
in the summer. It was August of 2022, as I recall, as the metadata from the picture tells me when
Ah.
I snapped a photo
Very
of
good.
that
Yeah.
storyboard.
Oh, so that's interesting timing wise, because that means we started planning this. That must have been right when I finished the yellow book then, because that would have been coming out that fall, right?
Yeah, the Yellow Book Storytelling with You, number 3 of
Yeah.
the current five book set.
So that's so obviously there's, as you said, Cole, there's been other texts that you've been working on sort of parallel to that, and
Yeah.
because my next question is about how you just handle the task of doing this alongside the day job and the sort of temporal dimensions, the commitments that you have to carve out to write and to spend time writing. Um, Especially, I mean, yes, there will, I'm sure, and you'll tell me this, there will be deadlines imposed or target milestones imposed by a publisher. But when it's all three of you from the same organization as well working on it, how do you fit it into all these other commitments that you're working on, all these other client projects you're working on, and not least the fact that you are also, correct me if I'm wrong, geographically spread as well.
Yep.
Just from a practical point of view, how did you go about it?
Well, I think it actually makes it easier that we all work at the same organization
Mm,
and have control over what scheduling looks like, because
right.
then we can say things like, summer's going to be lower on travel, so let's write as much as we can during this
Yeah.
amount of time. Or we can say, well, let's lighten the workshop load. Mike and Alex, we have other people on the team who can pick some of that up so that there is time for writing. Though it's funny because I say this, and this is like in an idealistic
Hmm.
world, what would have happened. Though then when it comes down to it and you're weighing a paying client versus writing the book, I don't know if
Right.
we actually did any of that in retrospect. Mike could weigh in here. But I think the deadlines do become important because,
Yeah.
and we have a history of like, or maybe I have a history of putting deadlines on us that are much more ambitious than anything the publisher is going to impose, which is nice because it then does give us a little bit of flexibility
Sure.
if we need. But this definitely, we ended up in crunch mode approaching the deadline to get everything done with this one.
As
But
one does.
as one does,
I feel like that is how everything always works, is if you're finished in plenty of time, you will go back and tinker
you
with
fill
it
that
until,
space.
of course
Yeah.
you will. I think that the nice thing about the blend of working with clients and working on this book is that the entire premise of this book is what has our work with clients inspired us
Mm.
to realize is something that is a common struggle that people have? What is it that was unique about this particular experience that we said, oh, this is something we want to tell more people about? This is such an excellent example of how to overcome this challenge, how to take advantage of this opportunity, how to work within these constraints. And we could use that, write about it, because we're all curious people. We all have this thing in our brain that says, oh, this is so neat. This was such an interesting thing to tackle.
Mm.
Let's talk about this with other people. This could actually be part of the book. And so we could do this as we were going and also
Real time.
leverage our experience of having done that over several years of working with a whole range of clients. So it wasn't as though we had to completely switch mindshare from one thing
Sure.
to the next. There is a nice dovetailing, blending. And so now we can use all of that experience, all of these examples, and share that to essentially everybody.
That's a great
Absolutely.
point, Mike,
Yeah.
because
Jump in, Cole.
some
Yeah.
of, oh, sorry,
No, no.
it's almost like going back and pulling some of the older examples were more work, if you will, because you have to remember what that was and how we want to frame it, versus if it's a conversation that's happening now, they're makeovers that we're doing in the moment, then you can just transfer that into the book pretty seamlessly.
And famously or infamously, I always have the Finding Dory approach of just keep swimming. I don't remember what just happened. I'll go back and be like, wow, that makeover was great. Like, yeah, you did that one like 6 months ago. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess I liked it then too.
Well, and
That's
I think as
interesting.
we go through the makeovers, we may have picked more from each other's than from our own. Going back historically, be like, Mike, you worked on this one. I remember it looked like this. Like, let's go find that. I think it was interesting.
No, I think, I mean, what's interesting there for me is you're absolutely right. It's almost that obviously there is work to gather, compile, and position the material, but it's crying out for being used. And obviously, you collectively will use it in things like talks. You'll use it, I'm sure, in shaping up the next client project that you work on. But being able to go back and sort of mine what's already happened, that's already compelling, is it's not free, but it's there, and it sort of demands to be used. I mean, the premise we've already sort of again sort of touched on briefly, but it's about makeovers. It's about before and after. It's about improvements. And I, again, just come back to this opening line, or one of the opening lines. Everyone loves a good makeover, which is the exact way anyone should start this book. Um, and I love a makeover. And I remember your talk, Cole, I think it was at the Tapestry conference, where you performed this kind of act of someone pretending to be doing this like dreadful talk, and then you sort of did the makeover. And I found that ever so compelling. And I think there were two things that struck me there about you, your work, and storytelling with Data's work in broader terms was it wasn't just this surface level makeover, which is important. Don't get me wrong. The kind of the look and feel is very important, but
Yep.
it was also the substance makeover, the message makeover, the content makeover. And then thirdly, it was almost, now in that case, it was a performance, but it was the delivery of it. And I think what you talked about in the introduction there, I think is important. It's not just about the graph, the chart, the thing, the asset. It's how that's brought into the real world and delivered
Yeah.
and sort of set free into the world. So obviously makeovers are the key premise of this, but I think again what struck me about the premise of a makeover is it's about cleaning, it's about decluttering, it's about this sort of sense of not necessarily adding more, but about taking away. And just to sort of kind of turn this into a question, you've talked there about these kind of client experiences that you've mined. How easy did you find it to basically find 20 sufficiently different enough makeover experiences that um, you felt justified? Would you be justified to go into a book? And what I mean by that is not that it's hard to find 20, but it's very hard to find 20 from the many I'm sure that you've got potentially to pick from.
Yes. I think the way we approached it was we started selecting, and once you start selecting, then you can see where do we have gaps or
Right.
opportunities? And we knew going in, we didn't know going in that there would be 20 makeovers. We knew going in, we wanted to have a number of case studies that would allow us to illustrate and teach a lot of different lessons. And we had the core things that we knew needed to be in there, enough to be memorable, but not so much that it feels redundant. But then that there are all these other tips and strategies that we apply when we're working with clients, and being able to highlight those in different places as well. And so practically what that looked like was we started picking the makeovers and putting them in a place where we could see them, and then started figuring out what are the lessons that we would want to bring to light in this
Right.
given makeover, knowing that it's the same foundational ones that underlie them all, but we're not going to go through the same process 20 times. That would be not helpful. And so how do we bring different lessons to light, or emphasize them in different ways, or show them applied in the same way in a different context, and all of this sort of mixing and matching that can happen. And as we started filling in, then we could say things like, oh, well, we wanted to highlight this over here, but we also wanted to do it over in this other one. Actually, this, example A is going to be better for highlighting
Right.
that. Let's move forward with that, and we'll do that less in this other one, or make it reinforcing as opposed to repetitive.
Yeah.
And so we had many spreadsheets and large spreadsheets going, and different organizational schematics, so that we could try to keep these things straight, because it wasn't a linear process where we started and finished one makeover and then moved on to the next one. We were all working on multiple chapters of makeovers at any given time. So the coordination across that, and definitely meant going back and trimming things back, or moving sections around so that they would be in one place versus in many places. But it was a matter of getting the basics there, and then filling in. So we knew we wanted representation across different industries, different graph types, different audience types, all of these different sorts of things, even just the look and the feel aesthetically, to be able to show some variety there. Mike, you have more to say probably on this topic.
The aesthetic part as well. It feels sort of prosaic to say we wanted to get ones that looked good.
Of
But
course.
of course you do, because if someone's going to scan through the book or flip through it, it can't just be a lot of graphs that look similar or aren't visually arresting in some way. But that's often not the point of communicating effectively, is to make something visually arresting. So we had to balance, well, where does it work versus where doesn't it work, which kind of gets back to the whole premise of the book writ large, which is, if we are able to teach you the foundational elements, and in class we'll say, don't do all of these things every time you do anything.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. You'll
Yeah.
never get anything else done. If nothing else, this book is, here's a situation, here's how we think through which of these techniques to use in this situation, and here's how you do it. Here's another situation, and here's how we did it there. It's almost like you're now going on your residency. This is your apprenticeship. Like you've done the schooling. Now here's how you would put it into practice in all of these different potentially high stakes or high tension scenarios.
Right.
And it tells you not just what tools you can have in your toolkit, but how you apply them in any given scenario.
Absolutely. I think, again, we just sort of step back and just think about the structure. So again, for those who are interested in the book, we've got essentially 20 core chapters, which are 20 makeover case studies. And they've all got a primary title, which is, I guess, the core essence of why you've picked that one and demonstrate that one. Although with each, there are typically 3 or 4 lessons that you can unpack at the next level beneath that. So I can imagine exactly what you've expressed there, that you went through each one and said, right, what are the 3 things also that this demonstrates, and then sort of work backwards to get the nice mixture of those. And then, yeah, each one has this sort of the structure of kind of 3 key lessons, and talks about the kind of before and the after within through the lens of each of those. Now, you said that the 20-ness of it was relatively arbitrary, but you obviously found that works well. It scans well as a structure. But it also meant that you have to leave some out. And I know, Mike, that you've written about a favorite makeover that didn't make it into the book. I mean, just editorially, was there kind of agony in, the examples 21 to 30 that were just didn't quite make the cut? How easy do you find it to cut this down to the ones that were included and the ones that were not?
Well, let's assume that we're going to go up to this pace of 4 books per year. We have to have more
Okay.
in order to do the subsequent ones. For
Well,
me,
and
yeah, go ahead, Cole.
I was just going to say one interesting anecdote that I actually had forgotten about until reflecting on it now. We didn't realize, and we should have done, but we had projections in our spreadsheet of how many words, how many visuals in each chapter. But even so, once the final book got put together and paginated, so you can actually see how long
Mm,
it's going to be for the first time, and it's approaching 400 pages, which was much longer. When we set out, we wanted to make a short book like the first one and
right.
keep it simple. And we had one discussion at one point that we put to rest pretty quickly, but maybe we split this into 2 books, and maybe it's not 20 chapters. Maybe it's 10 chapters in one and a second edition with 10 more case studies. But in the end, we didn't do that. We could have done. But I don't remember any agony per se, but I think it's because we filled in the examples versus took everything we've ever done and tried to whittle it down from there.
Sure.
I think that would have been a harder process. But we used our memories and our well labeled filing system to kind of go back through and identify the ones that ended up in the book.
And let's face it, the ones that don't make it in the book are still material. They're
Yes.
still case studies to point to it in the client work. They're still examples used in the teaching. It doesn't necessarily all have to go in this single book for it to still be valuable. But just picking up on the point you made there, Cole, about the variety of industry charts being represented in the book. And I always found this quite an interesting thing in my work with clients and delegates on courses, which is they always want to see their stuff. They always want to see their topic in the chart examples that I show. And it's ever so hard because, if you're working with a relatively niche industry, there just aren't, wells of public examples of that kind of topic being analyzed in visuals. And so one of the things that I'm always, and don't get me wrong, part of this is a little bit of my own laziness of not wanting to customize every course. But part of my defense against that is that you need to learn to look at a chart and see beyond the topic and see the
Yeah.
chart choices, the design choices, the layout choices, which we all know this already. But did you feel nonetheless it was still important for the readership that you are working this towards to have a spread of different industries just to make sure that everyone can see almost some representation from their world?
I almost don't even want it necessarily to be representation from their own world, because I
Right.
think, to your point, one of the things that we are always encouraging anyone in our workshops or who's learning from us is there is something to be learned from every example, even if at first glance, it's in a different industry or with a person of a different type of role, or if it's a different audience. If you're wanting to learn, there is some nugget of wisdom to take from every
Mm,
example. And I actually find when we teach, we typically do a balance of examples that we're bringing in that do cross a number of different industries, and then some from the given group, the given organization, or something that's closer to
mm,
them. So we find when we're using more general examples, or examples that aren't from the person's specific world, it actually opens people up, where they're
yeah.
not thinking that they're confined in how they always approach things because it's their direct work. And if you can convince someone in a relevant but not immediate example of the valid and utility of some of these approaches, then you can get them to agree to it and then be like, oh, yeah, actually, I can see a way to do this in my work. We do find, though, that also, especially in a workshop setting, of having there be examples that are from the work, because otherwise there is an excuse that people will often use to say, yeah, but that worked there, but it doesn't work for my
Mm,
special situation. And so I think that's where then coming back to the book and saying, let's cross a lot of industries so that we can hopefully show something of that, of like, yes, it does work in your
mm,
specific scenario, but it works more broadly. And when you think about things more broadly, there's more you can learn from that exercise, which hopefully comes across.
right. Absolutely. Um, Now, as I said, we've got the 20 makeover case studies, and as we all know, nothing is done arbitrarily. So the sequencing of those 20, is there a thought process behind that? Well, there will be, but is there is there a criteria? Because I'll come to you, Mike, on this one, because it's not like necessarily the 20 are in sequence of the equivalent of going from San Diego to Boston, but I imagine there is a sense of a natural ordering that you're trying to convey in terms of lessons. What was the sort of thinking behind that kind of organization?
It is a loose ordering of examples where I think some of the examples that are perhaps more straightforward, perhaps more simple, more tuned towards the fundamentals occur towards the beginning of the
Right.
order. There are some towards the middle where you're starting to apply multiple lessons simultaneously, or maybe we're moving into scenarios that you don't normally think of applying these techniques to emails, for instance, to reports, to
Uh-huh.
infographics, where normally we think of, oh, I thought this was just for slides and graphs, but there's actually
Mm,
lots of other opportunities. And then towards the end, you see many more of the full long form narrative explanations, long form narrative makeovers, and a few other chapters
mm,
about things that it would behoove you to have taken more of the previous chapters into consideration. You'll benefit more towards the end. But that's not to say you can't jump in on any given chapter
right.
and pick it out and read it in whatever order it appeals to you.
Yeah. And I think that sense of a book that works at both a level of cover to cover and also dip in, dip out is the perfect harmony of both options for people. Um, Again, we spoke about how the fact that there are three of you working on this, and although you are all singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of espousing the same principles, and I guess organizationally, just through working together, you'll have found a literal language and delivery of a degree of commonality there. But nevertheless, when it comes to writing, we still have our own voice. How did you find the writing task as a group in terms of having that individual space to write your thing, not least because I'm sure you wrote about the makeovers that you were kind of personally involved in largely, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about that. But then also make sure that there wasn't this kind of clunking difference in voice or pitch or kind of cadence from one chapter to the next. How did you practically write the book, really?
We had a decision point early on, though I don't know if we made a decision on it until a bit later in the process, but which is, do we write this all as a single voice and you don't
Mm,
necessarily know who is writing, or do we do some sort of byline for what each of us wrote? And there are some things that you have to do, putting structure in place when you have multiple people writing. For example, how are you going to present the case studies? Is it past tense? Is it present tense? Are you saying I or we? Some of these
yes.
things that need to have relative consistency across the book so that it's not jarring when you move
Mm,
from one chapter to the next. But in the end, I think we're lucky in terms of we've all worked together and taught together for so long that our voices, while distinct, to your point, are all, it's the fundamental lessons that we're pulling from in similar language. So it gives us this basis of nomenclature to be able to pull from where we're all speaking the same language. But we also definitely have our own personalities when it
mm,
comes to writing. I love some of the analogies and like 80s trivia that Mike pulls into his writing. Alex looks at things through a totally different visual lens that can be really useful. And so we decided, as you can see from the book, that we're
yeah,
going to put our names on each chapter and let
yeah.
it be from us so that we're not trying to write in some voice that is not anyone individually, which I think is more appealing. It's always how I've wanted to write, as if I am speaking to someone. And
Absolutely.
so this
Otherwise, it
allowed
becomes
each of
too
us to do
beige
that.
and too
Yeah,
averaged out and too sort
Exactly.
of smoothed. Anything to add, Mike?
This is also how we have always approached writing for the Storytelling with Data blog.
Uh-huh.
It was actually part of my job application process was write a blog post that would seem at home on the blog. So it was learning how to embody the style of storytelling with data while maintaining your own voice simultaneously. And Alex and I have a lot of practice at doing that over the years that we've been at the company. So it was only natural for us to then apply that same principle, those same principles to writing the book and taking our own unique perspectives and putting them together, to Cole's point, it would feel weird if we were writing as a collective, but the voice slightly shifted from chapter to chapter. It would feel a little Cerberus-y, I guess, like which one of these heads is talking at any given time. And that's not a comfortable experience for a reader. I always like the variation in voices too. We do this in workshops when we teach them in a team because we think it keeps people more engaged, more interesting to hear that variation rather than just one voice constantly. So as you go through the book, I think that also helps to keep people propelled forward, is
Absolutely.
hearing more things from different voices.
Yeah, I think it brings a different texture to each chapter, which is, as you said, Cole, it's that sort of sense of there's room for personality. There's room for a person to kind of come through this. Now, this set of questions, I didn't give you enough advance warning that I would be asking this, so please don't worry if you can't select a chapter to answer these following prompts. But I wondered if there were specific chapters that you felt, first of all, were just this is the most kind of common, this is the most quintessential makeover that we encounter time and time again. Which chapter do you think would capture that essence? I suspect it's one of the earlier ones, as you spoke about before, Mike, but is there one chapter you think, yeah, that is the one that we keep encountering?
For me, it's chapter 2, which was the first chapter of the case studies that I wrote, and it's called Embrace Basic Graphs. And I go through one example where it is a line chart that should have been a bar chart, and another
Right.
example that is a bar chart that should have been a line graph. And so it's using the simple things, but using them in the way they were meant to be viewed. And it
Got you.
highlights that process of iterating and looking at the same data in different visuals so that you can both learn what you want to say about it, but then also make that message clear to your audience.
Good answer. Mike, similar?
The chapter for me when working with clients that I see most often represented is chapter 8, when chapter 8 is about knowing your audience, but the premise there is a slide that shows a bunch of data in a violin plot, and then there's some other words around it trying to explain what's going on. And what I commonly see is people think that something is so obvious to themselves, they assume it's going to be obvious to other people.
Right.
When I looked at this for the first time and it was nearly impenetrable. And this is something that we all fall victim to. We all think that everybody sees things the same way we do. We all suffer from that same curse of knowledge. And it is a good visual reminder of, if this doesn't make sense to you, remember that it did make sense to somebody else.
Yes.
And we all do this. So it's getting in the head of your audience and making something that's going to make sense to them right away, especially because it's obvious that whoever created this did a lot of work on it and is desperate for you to understand what the implication is of it. And you don't want all of that work to go for naught.
Yeah. And we can get overly precious about our creations, whether they're common charts, whether they are kind of very bespoke and ornate charts, but it's hard to have that discipline. I think it's a key message. Yeah. So my next question then is, which of the chapters do you think represents the sort of showstopper, the one that, I don't know, you always feel if we had one makeover to sort of showcase the field and our practice, this is the one. This is the one that always kind of gets the, oh yeah.
For me, it would be chapter 18, which is about explaining with stories, not dashboards, where we start off with a slide that's got 4 graphs on it, and they feel like a bunch of disparate data that's been smashed together. There's nothing that ties it together or tells a story. And then going through the process of figuring out, well, how are these things linked together? How can we understand them in a robust way rather than piece by piece? And this really interesting story emerges that then when we apply some relatively simple things, you can bring people along to that. And in that particular situation, it ended up being a waterfall chart that collapsed time down to the then and the now in order to see the pieces in between. But then you can use that as this sort of meta view where you're anchoring people on it to show the big picture, but then diving into each of the bars of the waterfall chart to show what happens over time. What does that actually mean for the business, and how do they interplay together? And so you keep anchoring people back to the main story so that you can both drive their understanding at a pretty detailed, granular level, but bring them back to the decision at hand and the thing that needs fixed.
Right. Mike?
Yeah, I agree. Chapter 18 is sort of a quintessential example of that. Another one from earlier on in the book is chapter 6, which is called Identify a Story to Tell, because it is an example of a graph about sales targeting in a certain segment of auto sales. And there is a compelling story there, but the graph doesn't tell it particularly well. And if somebody just comes in and thinks through, well, how would this make sense to a layperson? And then how would my visuals effectively support this interesting, if slightly nuanced story, if I could do it step by step, or even if I could do it by organizing some data and words more thoughtfully on a slide, this would be so much clearer and have such more dramatic impact. And I always appreciated that one, which is one of Alex's makeovers.
Right. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that they're both very good examples of kind of the pure impacts that a makeover demonstration really can have. So my last question on this in this sort of theme is there a makeover in the book? And it may be that it's not in the book, but is the one that's I'm just trying to think how to articulate this, that's almost like the most recent new kind of situation that you've encountered? Is one that you thought, oh, you know what? We've not come across this particular problem many times before. Is there one that kind of demonstrates that? And again, it may be one that maybe just missed the cut for the book because it is perhaps something that's more uncommon in terms of its encountering. But is there one that you feel that really kind of maybe gave you a new challenge most recently in terms of how to find a solution?
I have one that is along those lines. It's not
Mm,
really what's new, but it's more about something that appears simple at first, but is actually incredibly confusing.
right.
And that was chapter 10, which is about essentially a very simple bar chart. It's just one bar chart, and it's showing the gap analysis of income at a number of different coffee shops in a particular neighborhood. But in what you would imagine is something that couldn't be more straightforward, it's actually incredibly confusing because it's using a very simple graph in a completely non-standard way. And I am always fascinated with something that appears to be one thing, but is actually something else.
Mm,
And that we always advise people, hey, there's almost nothing simpler than a bar chart. You can barely go wrong with a bar chart, except guess what? I found this case where this bar chart took us in a completely wrong direction. And there are so many other ways that we could show this that is so much clearer. And it's one of my favorites in the book, which isn't new, but it was a distinctive example
yeah,
that I enjoyed walking through and telling the
a
story of.
deceptively difficult one. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yourself, Cole?
The one that comes to my mind also isn't new. I think we encounter it as a scenario perhaps less
Uh-huh.
frequently. And just, it's one of my favorite examples in the book. Mike, it's one of yours. Chapter 17, Find the Right Level of Detail, where he's plotting call center data over time and goes through this practice of, if you aggregate it in minute bins, it's noisy for all of these reasons. We can do 5 minutes, we can do 10 minutes, we can do an hour, and then you lose some of the things. And he shows in a really nice way how, depending on what it is you want to be able to show, there are different levels of aggregation that are going to allow you to do that. So when you
Mm,
need to see the outlier of the system failing so that you can put precautions in place and not have that happen again, and then we're going in 5 minute bins, and I'm going
yeah.
off memory, so this is invariably not exactly right. Whereas if you need to tell the team, when is call volume typically low, so you should plan your paid time off or do these things, doing team activities, then it's a different level of aggregation that you need. And just being able to see that in a concrete example
Yeah. Yeah.
is helpful, because a lot of time aggregating data are decisions that we make without really thinking about it or thinking about what we might be hiding or missing as a result of those decisions.
And I think that's really important in a way to frame, for us to at times frame that in a slightly more positive sense than we can get accustomed to, which is to say that these are ways of distorting the data and kind of hiding the message when actually it's often just innocent, non-malicious choices that kind of miss the message. But it's equipping people with a sense of here's the consequence of choosing this bin level, and here's the consequence of this. And you might need all simultaneously to do different things,
Yeah.
but you're giving the person that understanding to make their own judgments. That ultimately we have to. There isn't a neutral person involved in this. It's an editorial choice, but
Yep.
here's at least some armory to get to understand what it is you're doing and what the consequences of those things are. So, no, those are great selections. Now, as we kind of wrap up the book discussion a little bit and segue into the field at large, and obviously we could spend hours sat here just chatting about where database is, but I think a useful segue really is to think about makeovers as a technical act or as a way that the book talks about to be done by humans. And this era that we are now rapidly living in of AI and how you might envisage the pros and cons, the risks, the opportunities of AI being a tool that people use to create makeovers. Is this something that you believe is an opportunity? Is it something that you see as being risky? I mean, personally, I would lean a little bit more towards the risk on one hand, taking away the human doing the makeover, and therefore not knowing the steps and not knowing the why and the what. But I also see the benefits of the speed and the also the inspiration that one can get from something that makes over a graphic for us by something else. But where do you sort of sit on this possible divide? I'll come to you first, Mike, on this.
Uh, so I often say that you could give me power tools, but you wouldn't want me to build your house.
Mm,
I think you want a skilled craftsman who knows what they're doing and then give them the tools so that they can apply what they're doing even more rapidly and they can
hmm
do things still with skill, but in a way that's more efficient, more effective.
Right.
Now, I can use power tools. I could use AI in a different milieu than what I am used to working in, but I wouldn't know if I were doing something that is acceptable, unacceptable. I use tools, existing business intelligence tools, to iterate through charts rapidly already. Like
Mm,
I can put data in and I can see what it looks like in a bunch of different ways. I
mm,
can very easily change the way something looks, the way your axes are, or how things are laid out on the screen. And yeah, AI might be able to do that from scratch faster, but how many prompts am I going to have to give it to get to what I wanted it to get to in the first place? Is this is this the data viz version of vibe coding where I don't know what's going on under the surface and somebody's going to have to come along and clean up my vibe vizzing at the end of the day
yeah.
anyway?
Yeah.
So I am always a little, I don't want to be the first adopter of this. I don't want to
Mm,
be blamed for something my AI tool did,
mm,
because that's at the end of it all is whatever you are presenting as your work, you are getting blamed for it
yeah.
or praised for it or ignored for it, whatever it is, whatever the reaction is your audience has to
Yeah.
it. But if I'm going to get blamed for doing something poorly, I would prefer that I had control over it and that I didn't delegate that responsibility to a
Sure.
black box that I didn't know how it came up with that. So it's always going to evolve. It's always going to continue to improve, assuming that it is still a viable business model for the people who are providing these tools
Sure.
for us. But until I'm comfortable with it, I will keep it in the hobby side of things rather
Sure.
than the professional side of things. But that's just one man's opinion. I could be wrong.
Well, what do you think, Cole?
I think for me, the ideal is if we can figure out smart, controlled places where we are using AI thoughtfully in order to, whether it's increase our speed or improve our accuracy. I don't want to take the human out of it because
Hmm.
that can go wrong in so many ways. And that I think is where anyone with an analytical mind, that like, this is the part where you're bringing value. When you can look at all the puzzle pieces and figure
Mm.
out for this given scenario, how do we put them together this time to make it work, to help somebody understand because we know them and we know what their preferences are and their biases are. But I think there's absolutely space to use AI within that construct really thoughtfully and use it for its speed and its thoroughness. So, for example, I'll sometimes mention one of my first projects when I worked at Google was reading through thousands of verbatim comments from our annual employee survey and trying to come up with categories and then read everything again to
Right.
put the comments into those categories. This was like a many month process that can be done with natural language processing now at the click of a button, which is
Mm.
amazing. And so when you can use that speed to then say, all right, now I know what it says. Now let me go in and understand how it did it and what I should pull out from this to use in a thoughtful way. Or AI can be great at pointing out blind spots. If you spend some time saying, here's the scenario, here's what I did, poke holes in it, or play the role of my snarky audience member who's going to want to prove me wrong. Like, how can I
Yeah,
bulletproof this? I think there are smart ways that we can use it that will help us be stronger as analysts, that will help us be stronger as presenters. But I think any sort of outsourcing the work to AI just will make people lazy and what sort of ill qualified in terms of understanding how things worked and knowing how everything got put together in ways that I think is dangerous.
I completely agree. And sort of summarizing your point and your point, sorry, and Mike's point as well, I think this notion of having some assistance to speed up, to automate, to scale, to do things at scale that we can't do reasonably ourselves, to use a degree of kind of artificial imagination, as you said, to sort of profile imagined audience members, that kind of thing. They're all positive ways that this can be engaged, but I want the agency and the control myself to do the things that only a human can really do well, when ultimately all these things are serving other humans. So I always feel it's really important to ground all this stuff in the human. So I think it's an interesting time, and I think just to sort of kind of wrap up the discussions really, we said at the start, Cole, this is sort of year 15 probably for you and your career. It's 10 years since the first book came out, and please plug what's coming to mark that 10 years in a second.
Yes,
Um,
happily.
what's, beyond the obvious AI, which is of the moment, how do you see the field has changed? How is it different? And maybe it isn't in many ways, but where do you sort of see that sort of long-term view of things?
If I think back to 15 years ago when I started really doing this stuff and started teaching, there weren't many resources out there.
Yeah.
And so that has changed markedly. Now there are so many different books out there, right? If you go back to, anybody who was doing this 15 years ago, right? You, Andy, me, Mike, that it was the same few books that we
Mm,
all started with because they were the only ones that existed at
mm,
that point, or the blogs even. There weren't many blogs. And so today there are so many more voices in the space, so many more books, which I think is a fantastic thing. The learning here has been democratized, which is great. I think, though, as a result of that, what we actually have now is a larger spectrum of people with different skills,
yes.
because we definitely still have the people who've never thought about data visualization or about how you make a good graph or communicate with data. And then we have people who've been practicing this and honing it over time. And so I think one of the things that we run the risk of in maybe not stepping back every once in a while and recognizing that there are still there's still people coming into this new who need foundations and similar language to be able to use and feedback in a positive manner, that we can't start teaching to people who've been doing this for a long time. And yet we still also need to reach those people. So I think the landscape is broader in terms of there being just more people at different points in the journey, if
So
that makes sense.
this elastic band has been stretched in all
Yeah,
directions,
yeah,
much more levels of like stratified sophistication and experience, much more diversity, both on the delivering and the authoring side, but also on the recipient side. So you're absolutely right. It's to me, it feels a harder field to define the boundaries of as it
yeah,
once did. I think the blurring of techniques is a positive thing, but it means that sometimes it's hard to sort of nail down. I mean, let me step back. I've hitched my wagon to visualizing data, and now at the moment I'm working on a project with sound. So am
yeah.
I? Do I need to rebrand completely? So the boundaries are very much kind of changing, evolving, and blurring. But I mean, Mike, you've been in the field for many years as well. So what's your sort of reverse mirror glance at this thing?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that you're working with sound because sonification was one of the things that had just come to mind. I didn't know you were working on that, so that's
Right.
pretty cool. But I think about the debate that I've had with people over the last several years of, is data visualization a career or is it a skill? And I would like to think that it is something that everybody who is a professional in the world, or who is a person who has to communicate with other human beings in the
Yep.
world, should develop for themselves. Charts aren't scary. Data isn't scary. It's something we all live with and work with and communicate with. And I would like to keep reaching those people who maybe feel a little bit cowed, who don't think about it as this is what I do for a living, but rather
Mm,
this is something I need to be skilled at so that I can make what I do for a living work more effectively, so I can be more persuasive, so that the stuff I do has an actual impact, to your point, Andy, on real human beings.
mm,
So I think it's changing in that there are more people who have identified as, I work in data visualization, and that's great. That does advance the edges of the field to your rubber band, your stretched rubber band. And there are probably as many, if not more, people who are studying things academically, the way we perceive things, um, the way that we understand, who are developing new ways of looking at data visually in multiple dimensions. And that's great. That's expanding the top end
mm,
of what we can do. But that base of the pyramid could be so much wider.
absolutely.
And that is why I have been so happy to be teaching people who in our sessions, it's not just people who are so excited about graphs, they can't wait to be there. A lot of times it's people who are there because they were told they had to be there. But then when they leave, they go, "Oh, I never thought about data that
Yeah.
way. I never thought about graphs. Like, I never knew this could be better. I never knew that this is why things weren't happening the way I wanted them to happen."
Yeah.
Those are the people that I want to reach, because I want them to understand how this can have such a positive impact on their own professional satisfaction and their own professional career.
And even just being participants in society. I mean, frankly,
Yes.
Yes,
even if you're
yes.
not going to make these things, you are exposed to these things. And I think one of the other byproducts of the book is surely to also benefit people who don't get their hands on the task of making these things, but encounter and read and probably get frustrated by these things others have made and sent them. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that wide base of this pyramid is extremely wide, and it's to Cole's point, how you simultaneously kind of reach something that's accessible and relevant to them, but also still top up the experience people's sensibilities as well in an ever-changing field. So yeah, lots of challenges, lots of changes, and I think we'll probably look over the next 3 to 5 years of rapid evolution, but hopefully, not hopefully, I expect the principles and the methods that are in this book will still endure through that time. And before I close the session, Cole, tell us about this 10th year anniversary of
Yeah.
the OG book.
Well, and it's funny because I think it's actually quite relevant to the conversation we're currently having, because earlier this year, I revisited the original Storytelling with Data, which was published in November of 2015, and went in thinking about doing a revised version. But what struck me most is how relevant the same foundational lessons really are. So actually, rather than completely revamping anything, what I've done is gone through and refreshed the dates, swapped a couple examples that felt a little dated for some more current context, and then added bonus material, which shows or recounts, I guess, the evolution of how I've thought about and how we've been teaching on a couple of topics in particular over the past decade. And those take the form of some additional appendices. So the OG has not changed. It's the same. It's been refreshed with new dates, but then this bonus content. And there are 3 additional appendices. One is on the narrative arc and how you can use story thoughtfully as a framing device in business communications. The second new appendix is on you and how you develop yourself as the voice of your data or what it is you want to communicate. And then the final new appendix leans into the before and after approach and shows additional model visuals and gives people some places to turn to for more information on each of those. But the crux of the new forward that I wrote is really, time has gone by. It's really, as you say, humans talking to humans is how this stuff gets done. And so the way that we do that hasn't changed. I think there are nuances, though, that go into that where it seems simple at first, but there are all these decisions that go every time into communicating. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we do that. But anyway, that has turned into a 10-year anniversary hardcover edition of Storytelling with Data, which I was just at the printing of in Kentucky yesterday. And I'm really excited to be able to share that. It comes out in November.
Wonderful. And you did the book smell test, which is always a key thing to do with any text that's out. Wonderful. Yeah. And I think you termed it earlier, book 5.5, not necessarily 6, but 5.5. So that's a thing to look forward to. And not least, book number 5, which is our primary concern right now, is something that's out now. And we'll put the links in the show notes, holding it up on the screen for those of you watching the video. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to chat with you both about this book. It's been a pleasure to read the book as well. And I wish you all the success for the 2 of you and Alex as well. So thank you, Cole. Thank you, Mike. And thank you to listeners and viewers. And catch you soon on another episode. Bye for now. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.